for joining us tonight. I'm Terry Holland, trainer of NLP, hypnosis, and timeline therapy.
And I am Stefano Casalter. I am a speaking coach and champion speaker.
Yeah. So tonight we're talking about empowering beliefs of master communicators. These are beliefs and attitudes that we believe that everyone who strives to become a better communicator or become a master communicator lives by. And these came out of NLP. So these are from the presuppositions of NLP, which are convenient beliefs that we adopt in neuro-linguistic programming. And we've adapted these specific ones for speakers. And when we are looking at speakers, we believe that all masterful communicators probably share these beliefs.
Now, I think you're going to hear us talk about NLP a lot. And the reason why is because that's what makes our training different than everything else. We believe that by harnessing the technology of NLP and the neurology and the linguistics, it's a powerful thing. And if you want to use these, you can use these to your advantage as a speaker. And you can take these empowering beliefs as givens if you want to get the most out of your presentations, your life, and relationships as well.
Yeah. First one is everyone has their own unique model of the world. Might be frozen. I think my picture's frozen. You can still hear me.
I can hear you, yeah.
And in NLP, we talk about the NLP communication. From something outside of you. Sorry, what was that?
I keep cutting out.
Am I?
Okay, I hear you now.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So everyone has a way of taking in information through your five senses of sight, sound, taste, touch, and smell. So something happens outside of you, you take in the information through your five senses, and then you put a label on that experience, and that's your self-talk, or we call that auditory digital. You take in about 11 million bits of information per second. That's a lot of information. And you can't keep all of that. You can't be aware of it consciously. So you filter that information, you generalize it, delete it, and distort it. So you'll generalize the information to make it like things that you've learned before. You will distort it. So if it's something new that you haven't experienced before, you'll distort it into something similar to what you've experienced before to make sense of it. And then you'll delete anything that's not relevant. And when that process is done, you'll have about 126 bits of information left. So you're going from 11 million bits to 126 bits. And that 126 bits makes up your internal representation of the world, or what you're experiencing. You take an external event and you make it an internal representation. And all of your internal representations combined make up what we call your model of the world. Now, there's roughly around 7.8 billion people on the planet. And that means there's 7.8 billion different versions of the world. And we're all existing together, but we all have our own unique model of the world, our own unique experience of what's happening outside of us. And everybody has their own unique model of the world. It's important as a speaker, I think, to recognize that everyone you're communicating with has their own worldview. And it's going to be different than yours. In fact, if you stepped out of your model of the world, if you could step into someone else's, you wouldn't even recognize where you are. It would be that different.
So in our lives and experiences, we need to expand the way we look at things. And this is important as a speaker because we need to really understand our audience. Our audience is the most important thing, because without them, we wouldn't be speaking.
Mm-hmm.
You could start looking at stories in different ways. Kind of think to yourself, would what would someone else think of this? What would this certain audience take with this message? It allows us to analyze our situations and our speeches to get different views. So you want to be able to understand that everybody has a different model of the world, not just what you have in your head.
Right. Right. Which brings us to number 2, which is respect the other person's model of the world. So not everyone is going to see things your way, and that's okay. And it's having that respect for the other person, that their model of the world is just as real as yours is. So what might be true to you may not resonate as being true to that person. They may not see things your way. And I think this is really important when we're considering an audience and how they might view what it is that we're speaking on, that they're going to interpret things in different ways. They're going to have different opinions, and being able to respect the audience in that way.
We have no idea what has shaped other people's model of the world. Sometimes you'll see people walking around in a different state, or they're cranky, or they're unhappy, or they're rude to you. You never know what has happened in that person's life. I think that's one of the most valuable lessons I've learned, is you don't know what has happened in people's lives. But there are some ways you can avoid this. And as soon as you start to respect other people's model of the world, you could start looking into how it affects your speaking. So, for example, if you are going to speak in front of a certain audience, learn a bit about what their audience is. Learn about the experiences. Sometimes if you're going to speak in front of a corporate audience, you want to learn, you want to phone ahead, talk to the meeting planner or the organizer or the boss, and find out what the culture is. What I like to do is find something that's funny, or an inside joke, or something that only they would understand. But by doing the research ahead of time and finding that out, you can use that to your advantage. And that's a great way to make people laugh when everybody feels like they're in on the joke.
Yeah, for sure. It's a really good tip.
So if you don't know, or you don't take your audience's model of the world into your case, you're going to build a brick wall. And there's nothing worse, I'll tell you, than making a brick wall in between you and your audience. It just kills the connection.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Should we go into number 3?
Sure.
The third one is the meaning of communication is the response you get. The meaning of communication is the response you get. So we have our intention, right? When we're communicating something, we know what it is we're trying to communicate. And sometimes maybe you've had this experience where the other person doesn't respond the way you think they should. Right? Have you ever had that experience when you're speaking?
I think about my son all the time, and my daughter. Sometimes I get pissed off when I'm trying to explain something to them.
Right.
And it wasn't until I learned this and started applying this rule in my life, is the meaning of communication is the response you get. So if they weren't understanding what I was saying, it wasn't because they're not paying attention, or they're stupid or anything like that. It's because I'm not explaining it properly.
Right.
So it really was a good shift in my mind, because instead of getting angry, I understood that it was me that had to make the changes. It was me had to explain things a little bit better. So it was a good shift in my thinking, learning this. And it applies to being a speaker as well. Check in with your audience.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the most important things you can do when you're speaking is check in with your audience. every now and then, especially as a trainer, if you kind of feel that people aren't getting it, just ask, does that make sense? You know, is because if it doesn't make sense, I'll go over it again. But you have to be able to, you can check in with your audience and they'll give you the clues that you need to change what you're doing. And don't blame your audience.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a big one. You know, sometimes the speakers, you think something's funny, for example, and then the audience doesn't laugh. It's not that they didn't get the joke, it's maybe that it wasn't funny, to be honest. Right? If they're not laughing, then don't blame the audience that they didn't get it or they're stupid or this audience has no sense of humor. It's maybe there's something that you can learn in that to change your delivery of it. Yeah, which I think brings us to number 4, which is there is no failure, there's only feedback.
Now, this is very powerful. If you feel that every time you have a setback that you're failing, that's all you're going to get is failure.
Right.
But if you take it as feedback, there is no failure. There's only feedback. You can take that feedback, make the changes you need to make. And it's very important as a public speaker, too. This is one of the most important things. We're not born great speakers. We can learn a lot from other people as well, but there's a lot of trial and error that goes into it. Evaluation forms are a good way to make sure that you're on the right track. You love those, don't you?
I love those.
You know, sometimes it's hard for me to take criticism, but you take it in stride. And we've talked about feedback before. Sometimes there's bad feedback, which you will get a lot of. But
Yeah.
for example, if you're a trainer, by using evaluation forms, get everybody to fill them out. Before they leave, you make sure they write everything down. And you're going to get a couple people that give you bad feedback or negative feedback. You can't please everybody.
Right.
So take the feedback in stride, but always realize there is no failure. There's no failure. Some of the best businessmen, the best masterful communicators, best leaders in the world, they all know there is no failure, just feedback.
Oh, Frida loves evaluation forms too.
Yes. You love filling them out or you love getting them?
Yeah. And then number 5, resistance in an audience is a sign of lack of rapport. So again, this goes back to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
I was going to say this goes back again to don't blame your audience. If the audience is resistant to your communication or you feel like they're not engaging with you or they're not connecting with you, then that's on you as a speaker to adapt your communication, to communicate in a way that creates engagement and rapport.
And that goes to the connection. You have to be able to connect. If you want to, fill the tank, you got to connect the hose to it. There has to be a connection if you want people to take action on your message or to buy your products and services. So if you're not getting the results you want, if you're sensing the resistance, it's just a lack of rapport. Then there's lots of ways you can go about gaining the rapport. And that all happens in the first few minutes mostly.
Yeah, and a few things you can do to gain group rapport are things like asking a question. Has anyone ever experienced this before? Raise your hand, have them raise their hand. Just that process alone begins to establish rapport. In NLP, we call it matching and mirroring. If I do this, I don't know if you guys can see my hand, but if I do this and you do this too, we're matching and mirroring each other. That begins to establish group rapport. So little things like that, asking a question, which causes the audience to go inside their mind. The moment someone's asked a question, we're conditioned to answer it. You can't not answer a question. So as soon as someone asks you a question and you go inside, that induces a very mild, light trance state. which is also going to elicit rapport.
Mm-hmm.
Ask your audience some questions, get them to raise their hand and connect with you. You can get them, and this one I would be cautious with because I see some speakers overdo it. But when you ask them to turn to someone beside them, give them a high five or say something to them, introduce themselves, that's also helping to establish rapport among the audience. Now, the caution with that is I've seen a lot of speakers overuse that. You only need to do that once or twice throughout a talk. If you're doing that to punctuate every sentence, it's too much. So once or twice throughout your talk is sufficient if you're doing that.
And this kind of leads into a good lesson on how to gain rapport with an audience. And it's important. Here's one of the biggest lessons I learned in my speeches. And when I was a beginning speaker, I used to tell inspiring stories about when I was in the restaurant business. And there was one time I was telling a story about how I changed the staff's whole outlook on everything. Their work, productivity went up, everything changed. And it was because I had led by example, and I never asked people to do something that I wouldn't do myself. So when I first started speaking, I would go and tell this story and tell people how awesome I was because I did this and it worked. And I remember one time someone stood up and he said to me, he goes, I've got one piece of feedback for you. He said, never be your own hero. And he sat down. And I kind of stood there and it just clicked in my mind. Yes, you can't be your own hero. I wasn't born a great manager. In fact, I had failed miserably in my first restaurant.
Right.
It was somebody's wisdom that helped me gain the attitude. And it was one of my first mentors, Roger. Roger, he told me, lead by example and don't ask anybody to do anything you wouldn't do yourself. And as soon as I changed my speech into how I wasn't great anymore, I learned the wisdom from Roger. People started getting it. People were like, okay, it broke the resistance down. It's instant rapport when you show your humility, you show your vulnerability, and show that someone else was a hero. It wasn't me. I wasn't born like this. I learned it from someone else. Mm-hmm. That's one of the most powerful ways to gain rapport with your audience is don't be your own hero.
Yeah.
So if you're getting resistance with your audience, there's a good chance that could be one of the problems that's happening.
Yeah. Which brings us to number 6, which is our last one. There are no resistant audiences, only inflexible communicators or inflexible presenters. Yeah, so it's really important as a presenter, as a speaker, to be flexible in your communication, being able to adapt to the audience. So everyone has a different learning style. They have a different model of the world, different worldviews, and they have different ways that they prefer communicating. So some ways that you can adapt your presentation and be flexible are to include stories. So include stories and metaphors and also some clear direct points. And that's going to help target different people in the audience and adapt your communication towards them. Also, some people are more visual, some are more auditory, some are more kinesthetic or feeling, and adapting your language to make sure that you match all of those. We tend to communicate from our own communication style. So for example, I'm more visual. I tend to use language that's a little more visual, and I tend to communicate in a visual way. Now, for someone who's auditory, they're not going to resonate with my message in the same way because I'm not using auditory language. In NLP, we say predicates. So one way to do that, to make sure you include everyone, and this helps establish rapport again with your audience, is to make sure you're using language that appeals to visual, auditory, and kinesthetic, and do that intentionally. And then also auditory digital, which is your more analytical language, words like thinking, sensing, more criteria-based language, including facts. So if you have a nice mix of story and metaphor, and you're mixing in some facts, some key points with that, and sprinkling in visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and auditory digital language patterns, now you're capturing everyone. It gives you more flexibility as a presenter. Another way you can do this, we call this an NLP chunk size. So the way you communicate through chunk size, and chunk size is a chunk of information. So some people are big picture thinkers. They like the big chunk, and other people need more specific details. So another way to adapt to your audience is give them a big picture overview at the beginning of your talk and then go into specific details. So someone who's a big picture thinker, if you start talking in specifics and you're really down in the details throughout your entire talk without giving them the big picture, they will check out immediately. They need to see the big picture before they can engage with you. So that's another way to be flexible and to gain rapport with your audience is give them the big picture. This is what we're going to talk about today, or today we're going to look at, and then chunk down into specific details. If they don't know the purpose of your talk, they'll disengage from you.
I used to think there was a problem with audiences. I remember this one speech I was doing. It was a very funny speech. And I was killing it with the speech. And I went to a different audience, and it was actually a different, say, ethnic group. And I gave the same speech, and it was straight crickets. With no laughter. If I could tell people were resistant about it. There was a brick wall in between us. It was terrible. I remember, and I talked to my friend Andrew. I said, Andrew, what the hell was wrong with that audience? He goes, nothing. He said the problem was your speech. It wasn't tailored to that audience. Some audiences don't like fart jokes, and that's and that's okay. So it was a powerful lesson for me to. It wasn't the audience, it's me. So I learned to change my material if I found something wasn't working. One good way to decrease resistance as well is a lot of people get into a way of teaching is it's more preaching.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to get your message across, you're going to have to use stories. So if you're getting resistance about facts and figures and other things like that, change your way of thinking. Use stories to teach. Use stories to explain. Coming from.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah. So, I have a caveat though when I'm saying that is I was presenting in front of a group of engineers,
Mm-hmm.
and I was using my old story thing to teach, and I found out that it wasn't working very well, as I actually needed more facts and figures in order to make my point. No matter how many colorful stories I told, it just wasn't as powerful to somebody that thinks in a black and white way. So it goes back, and this is basically the whole message of this webinar tonight is know your audience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You really, know your audience and be flexible in your communication to be able to adapt to them.
Absolutely.
I'm curious, Frida, what was it that you found was the biggest difference in coming from Africa and talking to Canadians? What was the difference that you picked up on? If you could share that, I'm just curious. And if there are any questions about anything we've discussed tonight, please feel free to post your questions as well in the comments.
Feel free to like this video, love this video, and if you found it helpful, share it with somebody else.
Yes. And we do have our Fearless Speaking weekend coming up, September 28th and 29th. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, the fearless speaker system it combines a lot of championship speaking styles and NLP to help you overcome the fear of speaking.
Mhm.
There's certain things that we do and say that give off unconscious signals to people. A certain way you stand or the certain voice you use. And there's techniques that you can use to keep people engaged for hours upon end. So we basically run through your focus. We talk about eye contact, how to have effective eye contact. What else is there?
We go into,
Tonality.
yeah,
Yeah.
tonality, body language, how to present yourself on stage.
Yeah, and it's 2 days of powerful techniques to give you a start. And even if you're a seasoned speaker, there's things that you may be doing that give off the wrong impression as well. Maybe it's something you haven't mastered yet. Well, this is a good time to come and
Mhm.
finally master those little nuances in order to help you become a better communicator, better speaker. It's a small part of the complete speaker system, which is our entire course.
Yeah. And we're also going to show you some techniques to overcome fear and stage fright, nervousness when you're speaking as well. So if you experience any of that, we give you some really powerful NLP tools to overcome that.
I always
Um,
say, I wish I would have had these when I first started. And the beauty of having me is I've made all the mistakes that you can imagine. it's, I've made every mistake you can imagine. So, we help you so you don't have to make the same mistakes.
yeah. Yeah. Frida just commented back and said it's a language. So
Mm-hmm.
we talk about pot plants here. Pot plants are potted plants.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's important to know those little differences in language from region to region, that a word can have a very different meaning here or if in Canada or the United States or Australia or anywhere can have a very, very different meaning. And that's important to recognize as well as a speaker, that the words you're using may mean something different if you're speaking to a different audience geographically.
yeah. You could say the same thing twice and elicit two different reactions.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. All right. I don't think there are any other questions. So thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Feel free to share this with anyone who you think may benefit. And we're here every Wednesday night with a new training, a different topic to help you become a better speaker. Do you have anything to add?
No, that's it.
All
Have
right.
a good night.
All right. Have a good night. Bye.